actually read from my short story collection, The Wishing Pool and Other Stories. And I think it's fitting to sort of have a historical photo behind me because this is really one of the few stories, maybe the only story, where specifically racism is the monster. And I did that deliberately. Just for a quick bit of background, I first published a story called Last Stop on Route 9 when I was in college. And I was being exposed to a canon that did not include a lot of, or hardly any, writers of color or Black writers. So by the time I left college, and especially by the time I finished grad school, I was really writing epiphany stories. I also wasn't exposed to a lot of horror in the canon and got the idea that it wasn't appropriate to write horror. So by the time I graduated an MA in English literature, I was writing epiphany stories primarily about white men. And that was what Last Stop on Route 9 was. It was literally a story about a guy who shows up at a gas station and we figure out he's sick. And that's it. Last stop. Get it? Anyway, when I was asked to write a short story for an anthology, I decided that I would reclaim that title as just all out racism as the monster story with a Black protagonist this time. It's a young woman named Charlotte, and it's loosely based on a true incident. When my husband and I actually were on my way from my mother's funeral, we got lost on a very rural 2-lane road in northern Florida. And that's where this story begins. They're leaving their grandmother's funeral. Charlotte doesn't know her cousin very well. So here they are in the car, lost. Charlotte hated the South. Her mother had fled Florida at first chance, never coming back to Gracetown after she'd gone to UCLA as a freshman. Just like Kai's dad, her Uncle Harry, who had joined the Army the day he graduated from high school. Uncle Harry loathed the town. He had spent 6 months in Gracetown's notorious reformatory when he was Kai's age, and he had blamed his parents for his imprisonment. It wasn't surprising that his son didn't feel much warmth for the recently buried Sadie Myrtle Jones Williams. Charlotte's parents had swapped Christmases between Oakland and Gracetown, but Uncle Harry's seat at the table always sat empty. His 4 sisters had taken bets on whether he'd show up for the funeral, and he had, sobbing worse than the rest. "I thought I'd have more time," he'd cried out in the church, although Grandmama had been 6 days shy of 80. Still, he had refused to set foot in Gracetown for a luncheon at the home of Grandmama's childhood friend. Kai was more a novelty than family to Charlotte. One reason, she had been glad to give him a ride. She'd only seen the kid 3 or 4 times, and the last time he'd been only 9. 12 was a different story. He was almost as tall as she was, and shit, we're in the middle of effing nowhere, Kai said. I won't say the F word because I don't know. Children are watching. "Hey," Charlotte said, "watch your mouth. You're not my mom. You don't tell me what to do." She stared at him so long that she nearly veered off into one of the ditches that yawned open on either side of the road. He'd been so quiet until now that his sudden rebellion surprised her. Her voice was ice. "Don't start with me, baby boy. This is not the time." His tone softened. "I'm just saying, nobody wants to be driving around in the middle of nowhere, dang." He had a point, but although she was only 22, she felt obligated to sound parental. "Watch your mouth around me, or you can walk," she said, and threw in, "Here?" Grandmama had always said that. "Here?" Charlotte heard Grandmama's voice in her ear, sharp as a whip. Her throat pinched tight with a smothered sob. This awful day had no end in sight. Kai looked away toward the unbroken forest and its tangle of trees and said, "My dad got locked up here. He told me that place was just a bunch of rednecks who hurt kids for fun. And he said Gracetown is haunted as shit." His voice trembled. For the first time, Charlotte realized he was cursing because he was genuinely afraid. What kinds of stories had Uncle Harry filled his son's head with? Grandmama had always said Uncle Harry should see a therapist, although she'd said it more like an insult than a recommendation. Her aunt said he'd never been the same since the reformatory, and maybe Grandmama had been in denial because she hadn't fought harder to get him out. To hear Uncle Harry tell it, his parents' attitude had been, Maybe it'll be a good wake-up call for him. Charlotte's mom had superstitions about ghosts too, but nothing like Uncle Harry's. That was a long time ago, Charlotte said. That place is closed now. Whatever, Kai mumbled. But again, Kai was right. They were alone. Charlotte hadn't seen another car in 10 minutes, maybe longer. A thick fog bank sat across the road ahead like a wall, and Charlotte felt a strong urge to stop the car and turn around. She checked the navigator. Satellite unavailable. The map showed the dot of their car surrounded by a sea of nothing. She and Kai had given up on getting a cell phone signal as soon as they passed the county line. It never failed. Whenever one thing went wrong, everything else joined in a chorus. She'd had her first car accident 2 years ago when she swerved to avoid hitting a dog on her way home from getting her wisdom teeth pulled. Today felt as cursed as that one. Worse, she'd just buried a grandmother she'd barely bothered to get to know, so both of her grandmothers were gone. She'd had a much closer relationship with her father's more cosmopolitan mother in Oakland, who ran a bookstore and hadn't been nearly as hard to understand beneath a thick country accent and old school rules. Damn, she said under her breath, and drove through the fog. It was so thick she braced for the car to shudder, holding her breath while all the windows went gray. I can't see, Kai said, but as soon as he said it, they passed through to the hot sun again, everything in bright focus. Only then she allowed herself to ponder it. Fog in the middle of the day, during the summer? The oddness skittered across her mind, though she shut down the part of her that wanted to panic. Like Kai had said, whatever. Evidence of civilization emerged ahead, a small billboard nearly covered by the trees with large red letters, last stop on Route 9, 1/2 mile, gas, food. All the paint was cracking in rivulets across the weathered wood. Yes, Kai said, at the same time she was thinking, thank goodness. She kept deities' names from her mind to avoid blasphemy so close to where Grandmama had lived, as if Grandmama might still hear her, or maybe, just maybe, cussing alongside God's name really was a sin. Listen, Charlotte began slowly, wondering if she'd been too harsh on Kai by threatening to make him walk. It sounds like your dad said some stuff to you that's pretty confusing and raw. Maybe he should have waited until you're older. Dad says you're never too young to know the truth. Kai recited it like a mantra. That sounded like Uncle Harry, all right. Every conversation was a speech. Yet he'd never told her about his time at the Gracetown Reformatory, not that she'd asked. What did he say happened to him when he was locked up, Kai? Kai parted his lips as if to answer, then changed his mind. He stared at the road ahead, eyes searching for the promised gas and food. He looked hungry enough to eat a wrinkled gas station hot dog or two. She'd been anticipating the feast after the funeral. Well, whatever it is, she went on, it's not happening now. It won't happen to you. What if we get pulled over and I get locked up for no reason like him? His pitch grew higher with his agitation. And then, who's going to pull us over? A raccoon? She said. Nobody's out here, right? Kai surveyed the empty road and both sides of the thick woods and nodded, smiling a bit at her joke. Poor kid. Charlotte needed to talk with Uncle Harry and let him know to ease back on his Gracetown horror stories. Uncle Harry was the oldest of the siblings, and Kai was a son he'd had from his third marriage late in life. He and his son were from two completely different worlds. When would Uncle Harry have been locked up? The 1960s? Black drivers in the South could just disappear in those days. Times weren't perfect, but they weren't still like that, at least. The gas station appeared, and Charlotte's stomach knotted. Shit. This building was an artifact, shuttered with planks across its windows. She could barely read the faded sign above the door, handy gas. It was an old-fashioned station with only two bright red pumps long out of service, their hoses emptied on the ground like oversized snakes in a blanket of pine needles. What the hell? Kai said, exactly what she was thinking. As Charlotte slowed, hoping the gas station would morph into an AM/PM like in California, she noticed a light in the woods to the left. A driveway from the road led to a second structure behind the gas station, a wood-paneled house hardly bigger than a cabin. But a light was on behind sheer white curtains, and a vintage round-hooded pickup truck was parked in the driveway, white paint also fading. Charlotte turned into the driveway at the last second, her tires skidding on mud. What are you doing? Kai said. That's a house. I'm going to knock on the door and ask for directions. That's crazy, Kai said. Haven't you seen Deliverance? Again, Charlotte looked at him with surprise. She'd seen the film in college, and once was enough. The banjo theme played in her head, cryptic. Your father let you watch? He says Gracetown is like Deliverance. I haven't seen it, don't want to either. Kai, stop freaking yourself out. Just stay in the car. Charlotte rarely missed a hashtag, so she knew that sometimes when Black people knocked on strangers' doors, they'd be met by gunfire. She remembered one Black woman's name in particular, Renisha McBride, and there were others. But she also wasn't going to let fear rule her life. It was broad daylight. She was lost. She was dressed for church. She would be fine. Charlotte didn't want to block the cabin's driveway, so she veered slightly to the right of it, a few yards from the house's door, parking beneath an oak tree that looked a century old. Something crunched beneath her tires, the sound of bad news. Damn it! Had she damaged the car? She turned off the engine and the insect's song grew louder. As Charlotte opened her car door, Kai grabbed her wrist. Wait! Don't you feel it? Feel what, sweetie? He stared at her, earnest, trying to choose his words. His grip was of eyes. It feels mad, like everything is pissed off. When she squinted, trying to make sense of what he'd said, Kai sighed and let her go. I can't explain. My dad says you can't always explain. And I think I'll end it there.